Terima kasih, Deti. Pagi, everyone. Pagi. Good morning. I've got a wonderful batik shirt, so I can't be hiding anywhere wearing this. It's a fabulous shirt. So thank you to my Indonesian colleagues. It's a pleasure to be back here again and to share in the friendship of all my Cochrane Indonesia colleagues. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence or living evidence synthesis. I'm going to tell you why it's important and why it exists as a thing, and then just to highlight a few initiatives that I'm working on with Cochrane Australia to support living evidence synthesis. So I'm going to start with a very serious and stern-looking man. I don't know who this person is. It may have been taken several decades ago. But there he is, he's in the library. He might be a librarian, he might be a clinician who's perhaps having a break during his clinical rounds, but he's someone who feels like he's on top of the medical knowledge. He looks reasonably satisfied with himself. But if we think about it, in the last 50 years or so, global scientific output doubles every 9 years. And if we were to take a picture of this gentleman today, he would be swamped under a tsunami of papers, and he wouldn't be anywhere to be seen. And this is the problem that we face in medicine. So this is a paper that was published about 10 years ago now, where it estimated that every day 75 trials and 11 systematic reviews were published. But this actually is probably a substantial underestimate, underreporting of what the true scale of trials and systematic reviews are. Some of you will be familiar with Prospero, which is the International Register for Systematic Reviews. It started about 5 years ago, and there are now nearly 60,000 systematic reviews that are registered in Prospero. And they are inundated, in fact they're overwhelmed with registrations. They now have this notice that they put on their website to say, please be aware that we are experiencing unprecedented demand in terms of registrations, and that there are certain types of reviews that they can no longer process. And if you go to PubMed and you use a systematic reviews filter in PubMed, you'll find that there are nearly 22,000 systematic reviews that were published last year alone. So there's an awful lot of research activity, particularly in research synthesis. So Houston, we have a problem. And the problem is that we have this exponential growth in research output. And of course, as people who are involved in evidence synthesis, people who do systematic reviews, who do guidelines, it's almost impossible for us to keep up to date with this generation of research. And that has consequences down the line. So much of this research may be lost or wasted. It means that when we come to make clinical decisions or policy decisions, we're often making those decisions without access to the best available evidence. And potentially, this leads us to a poor quality care and low value care. So this is a scenario that we'll be familiar with for many of you. And I want to focus really on the problem that exists within systematic reviews and guidelines. So some of these problems will be well known to those of you who are in the evidence synthesis world. We know that the time it takes for reviews to go from protocol to publication can be anywhere from several months to many, many years. Within Cochrane, we've tried all sorts of things to reduce the timeline that it takes to go from protocol to review. But it's still very difficult to close that gap to anything less than about a year to 2 years. The increasing output of research and the time it takes to do reviews means that once reviews are published, often some of those conclusions may be out of date. So a paper that was published over 10 years ago now, but a landmark paper at the time, looked at the survival of systematic reviews once they'd been published. And they found that about the median survival time was about 5 years. So you could expect that after 5 years, the majority of reviews will then be out of date. So we face this issue here. Oh, sorry, that we want to do high-quality systematic reviews, reviews that inform practice, reviews that inform policy. But increasingly, the methods involved to do these reviews are becoming more sophisticated and more challenging, and inevitably, those reviews take longer to do. But we also want evidence that informs practice and policy to be up to date. And so we have this trade-off. We can either do very high-quality reviews, but perhaps we have to sacrifice currency, or we can have current systematic reviews, but potentially we have to sacrifice an element of quality. So what we really want to try and do is to gravitate all of these reviews up into the top right-hand corner so that we have high-quality, up-to-date systematic reviews that inform policy and practice. And that's the challenge that all of us face who are involved in doing systematic reviews, who work for systematic review organizations, is to try and achieve this aim. These problems also exist within guidelines. And a few years ago, the National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia published a discussion paper on the state of the art in clinical practice guidelines. And they identified these following challenges with how guidelines are produced in Australia. So the processes are often cumbersome and slow, leading to inefficiency in production. There's a great variability in the quality of the guidelines that are produced. There's a lack of technical capacity to write guidelines, a lack of investment in IT to try and improve the process for doing guidelines. Often, when guidelines are produced, they sit on shelves, they don't get used, and they're inaccessible. And finally, there's the issue of obsolescence, which is that recommendations in guidelines may quickly go out of date. So these are issues that can also be applied to other forms of evidence synthesis, such as systematic reviews. And we've all, within Cochrane, grappled with these to some extent. So I want to focus on a couple of these challenges in the rest of the presentation and highlight a couple of the things that we within Cochrane Australia are trying to do to address some of these challenges. So the first approach is around trying to improve the efficiency of systematic reviews and also guidelines by focusing on one of the major pinch points of evidence synthesis, which is the identifying the literature, screening the citations, and selecting the studies. So within Cochrane, in the last few years, we've had a major initiative under the banner of the Project Transform to combine crowdsourcing and machine learning to improve the process by which we identify and select studies. I'll just give you a little information about both of these things. So Cochrane Crowd is Cochrane's citizen science platform, and some of you may have been familiar with this through Cochrane Indonesia. And I would encourage anyone who wants to get involved in Cochrane. It's a great way to have a small but important contribution, and you can build up your profile within as a member of Cochrane by joining Cochrane Crowd. And most of the tasks on Cochrane Crowd focus on classifying and describing health research. So this is open to anyone. There are these micro tasks, so we break down aspects of the review process, particularly focusing on study identification, into these small tasks, which you have training, and there's short training videos, and you train on a data set, and then you get launched onto the tasks themselves. So Crowd now has nearly 15,000 members across nearly all countries in the world. One of them, the principal task really of Cochrane Crowd is to help identify reports of randomized controlled trials from records that have come from different databases. So from Embase, from PubMed, from clinicaltrials.gov. We screen and search these databases, and we push these citations through to Cochrane Crowd. And we ask the crowd to make a decision about whether they think this particular abstract describes a report of a randomized trial or not. And there's an algorithm that sits behind the crowd to make sure that there has to be 4 consecutive confirmation decisions before a record is passed through to the Cochrane Trials Register. So this is something that you can do online, on the mobile, when you're traveling. It's a very easy thing to do. So since Crowd started 3 or 4 years ago, they've identified over 140,000 reports of randomized trials, and these have been pushed through to the Cochrane Central Register. So for people who are doing systematic reviews, who are doing guidelines, this then becomes the biggest and most comprehensive source of randomized trials that we have available to us. So it's a huge effort done by volunteers. In addition to the records that they've identified as trials, they've also screened another 600,000 records as not being reports of randomized controlled trials. So it's a huge volume of citations that have been screened. But these rejects are also very important because we can use the information from the crowd about those records that are trials and those records which have been rejected to train the machine to help do that process even quicker. So this is where the machine learning classifiers have been developed in the last 2 years. So a classifier essentially will be able to predict, give a probability score to whether any particular record or citation reports or does not report a randomized controlled trial. And it gives a probability score from 1 to 100 about the likelihood of that being the case. And because we've been able to train the machine on so many hundreds of thousands of records, it's extremely accurate at being able to differentiate between a randomized controlled trial and something which is not a randomized controlled trial. So the data set that's been generated by the crowd, that's been used to train the machine classifier, and we also then used it to validate and calibrate the machine learning classifier. And the great thing is that as more and more records are screened by the crowd, we can then tweak the machine learning classifier to become even more accurate and even more efficient. So it's now embedded within the Cochrane workflow processes. People who do reviews of randomized controlled trials can use the RCT classifier to help with their screening, and it has a recall of over 99%. The other way in which we are implementing the RCT classifier and the crowdsourcing within Cochrane is this initiative called Screen for Me. So for people who are doing quite complex reviews that might involve searches of different databases in public health interventions, for example, it may generate several thousand citations. And that's often one of the areas which really is a bottleneck for review efficiency. It requires members of the review team to sit and sift through thousands of citations. So what we've done from April this year is to roll out this Screen for Me service. So if you've got a review where you're screening thousands of citations, we can first of all remove those citations which we know the crowd has already screened and made an assessment about. We can apply the RCT classifier to those citations that remain, and then we can send what's left to the Cochrane Crowd to screen. So this has been an enormous benefit to reviewers and review teams that have made use of this process. So, for example, we've had 8 reviews that have gone through this process in the last 6 months. In total, those 8 reviews have generated nearly 100,000 citations. But the process of the known assessments, the RCT classifier, and the crowd has reduced the screening burden by over half. So it's something that is obviously much appreciated by the systematic review authors at the end of the process. The other way in which these processes are being implemented within Cochrane is to support living systematic reviews. So these are reviews that have been around for about 12 months now. There's a small number of living systematic reviews in the Cochrane Library. And the idea is that for certain topics that are high priority for decision makers, whether for clinicians or policymakers, where the evidence is perhaps uncertain and there's plenty of new research that's likely to come through the pipeline, then we can do these living systematic reviews. And so every month, authors will screen citations that come from Cochrane, from Central, from PubMed, and so on. We'll use the classifier to help with that screening process, and then the review gets updated as and when new trial evidence informs the review. So these are now, they're still fairly small in number, and it's likely that only for those topics that are really high priority where there's fast-moving research being published, but we will support that by these living systematic reviews. Okay, so what I want to just focus on in the last part is about this issue around obsolescence. And so this is where evidence that's being used to inform guidelines is potentially out of date, and we don't really necessarily know when those recommendations go out of date. So if you think about a guideline, when a guideline is published, the hope is that all the recommendations that are informing that guideline are going to be up to date. They're informed by high-quality systematic reviews or primary studies. The problem that guideline developers face is knowing what is the optimum time to update the guideline. If we update too early, the chances are that we spend a lot of effort, a lot of time focusing on recommendations for which there's no new evidence, and there may be one or two recommendations that we can update. If we wait too long to update our guideline, we might find that the vast majority of recommendations in the guideline have expired. They're already out of date, and so the guideline is not recommending current best practice. So what the ideal solution would be is to update these guidelines dynamically as and when new evidence is published that informs and changes the recommendations. So if you can imagine, we would then have a system whereby as these recommendations became out of date, they would be dynamically updated with new evidence. So that is the goal, I think, of this living evidence synthesis. So one of the projects that Cochrane Australia has been heavily involved in the last few years is a collaboration with guideline developers in Australia to try and improve the efficiency with which guidelines are produced and to reduce this obsolescence. So I've been doing some work with the Stroke Foundation. They produce the stroke management guidelines. These are a massive guideline. There are over 89 clinical questions, 300 recommendations. And the 4th edition of this guideline was published in 2017. And it took 5 years for that guideline to be updated from the 3rd edition. It was a huge undertaking. They screened nearly 110,000 abstracts for the updated guideline. They know, and I think this is probably an underestimate, that 150 new randomized trials and systematic reviews are published each month in stroke. And also we find that this evidence is scattered among the literature. So the guideline developers, one person in particular who'd been responsible for several editions of the stroke management guidelines basically said, this cannot go on. We cannot continue to produce these guidelines on the current basis of updating every 3, 4, or 5 years. It's just too much effort. And so the decision was made to transition from a one-off update to a transition to a living mode of guideline. So this is the vision that the Stroke Foundation has. They're quite unique really in Australia in that they have both an evidence synthesis role as well as a knowledge translation role. So they're responsible both for generating the evidence that informs the guidelines, but also they do a lot of clinical practice audit, and that makes sure that questions that get addressed in the guideline are relevant to clinicians and to patients as well. So they're kind of a holistic approach to producing and disseminating evidence. But what we're interested in this particular case is looking at how do we make sure that new research is pushed through the evidence pipeline. So I'm responsible for the searching. We generate around about 280 to 300 citations in reviews and trials every month. We also search for patient preference values and economic studies. And so we then use the RCT classifier to help with that screening load. So we use the classifier, and that's reduced our screening load by nearly a fifth for those citations going back over the last 3.5 years. Those citations are then inputted into Confidence, and the guideline working group members will then screen relevant citations and use that new evidence to look to see whether the guideline recommendations need updating. So if you go to the website now, it used to be called the Clinical Guidelines for Stroke Management 2017. So they've dropped the 2017, and here they talk about that these guidelines are evolving into living guidelines updated as new evidence emerges. And so as of last week, the first 3 recommendations have been updated based on the screening of the literature over that last two-year period. So those are the 3 recommendations that are now have been updated, and then all of the other recommendations and topics that have been checked to see whether they're still current, they're listed there with no changes. So this is an example of where an organization producing guidelines can disseminate and publish that information in a living form. So we're also working with several other guideline groups, including David's group, which is the kidney health. We've got diabetes, heart foundation, and arthritis. So together we're forming this consortium to collaborate and share knowledge and platforms as to how we can better produce guidelines more efficiently. So if we think about where we're coming from a position where it may take several years for primary research evidence to be produced, generated, and published. To do the systematic reviews may take 1 to 3 years. We've then got this time lag for reviews to then be informing guidelines, and this process, of course, is taking many, many years for evidence to inform practice. We're now looking to this living evidence mode, so we call this the next generation evidence, where we're trying to really fast-track that process from decades down to a few months, whereby evidence that at it's published is included in the recommendations, gets disseminated, picked up in decision support systems, and can inform practice. So that's a combination of working with different technology platforms, making sure our processes are reliable and efficient, and working with collaborators, with people as well. So that's the vision that we're trying to, I guess, achieve and to support in the work that we do. Now, I started with a stern, serious old white man, and I sort of apologize for finishing with another serious-looking white man. But this quote, I think, is very apt. So research must be actively pursued and developed, and as fast as new knowledge is acquired, it must be applied. So I think that's what we're all aiming for, is to make sure that knowledge really does inform practice, it informs policy, and it does that in a timely way. I don't want to finish on an old, stern white guy. Can I finish on a slightly less old, less serious, white guy. Thank you, Jerry McCassie.